There is a version of Marvin Gaye that most people never think about. Not the voice, not the smooth, romantic figure that Motown spent years packaging and selling. The other one, the one who sat alone in a studio at 2 in the morning, picking apart chord progressions that nobody asked him to figure out. The one who could hear a melody once and rebuild it from memory, note by note, without ever reaching for a pen. The one who understood music not as a product, but as a language, and who had been speaking it fluently long before anyone gave him permission to. That version of Marvin rarely made it into the official story, and that silence had consequences. By the early 1970s, Marvin Gaye had already survived more than most people in the industry understood. He had survived in the specific way that people who have learned to absorb damage survive, quietly, incrementally, at a cost that doesn't always show up on the surface until much later. The music business has a particular talent for taking that kind of survival and converting it into something marketable. It looks at a person who has come through fire and sees not a person, but a product. A story it can sell, an image it can package. And it had been doing exactly that to Marvin for years. He had watched Tammy Terrell collapse in his arms on a stage in Virginia. He had spent 3 years watching her fade through 8 brain surgeries, visiting hospital rooms where there was nothing useful he could say or do. He had fought Motown over What's Going On, an album Berry Gordy initially refused to release, calling it uncommercial, calling it too political, calling it a mistake. And he had been proven right in a way that the industry still hadn't fully absorbed. But being right didn't earn him respect inside the rooms that mattered. It earned him a more complicated kind of scrutiny, because Marvin Gaye, in the minds of many people around him, was a singer, a beautiful, commercially valuable, emotionally resonant singer. That was the box. And the music business, then as now, preferred its artists to stay inside the box they had been assigned. Sly Stone did not have that problem. In 1971, Sly Stone was one of the most discussed musicians alive. His band Sly and the Family Stone had spent the late 1960s rewriting what popular music was allowed to be: racially integrated, genre-defying, politically charged, sonically dense. Sly himself played multiple instruments at a professional level. He produced, he arranged, he wrote, he performed. In an industry that had learned to separate its creators from its performers, Sly operated in a category that was difficult to dismiss. When he talked about music, people listened. When he had an opinion about another artist, it landed differently than most opinions did. Which is why the thing he said about Marvin, in a room with other people present, carried the weight that it did. The music world in 1971 had an unofficial hierarchy of credibility, and at the top of it were the people who made the music with their hands. The producers, the arrangers, the multi-instrumentalists who could pick up anything in a room and make it speak. In that hierarchy, being a vocalist, even a transcendent one, put you in a different category. It was a category with its own prestige, but it came with a ceiling, and the people above that ceiling, the people who built the architecture that vocalists lived inside, were not always shy about reminding you where you stood. The details of exactly when and where it happened have been told in different ways by different people. What stays consistent across all of them is the shape of the moment. Sly, comfortable and expansive in the way that people are when they know they are the most accomplished musician in a room, made a comment about Marvin Gaye's relationship to his instruments. The precise words vary depending on who is recounting the story, but the meaning was clear. Marvin could sing, nobody disputed that, but singing in Sly's framing was not the same thing as playing. And playing, really playing, understanding music from the inside of it, being able to sit down at any instrument and pull something coherent and living out of it, that was a different kind of credential. One that Marvin, in Sly's estimation, did not have. It was said casually. That was the thing about it. Not as a direct confrontation, not as a challenge issued face to face, but in the way that certain confident people make observations about others. As if the observation is simply true, as if it requires no defense because it is merely stating the obvious. Marvin was a vocalist, a great one, but a musician. That word, in the way Sly used it, meant something narrower and more technical. And the implication was that Marvin didn't qualify. People in the room noticed. People in the room waited. Marvin heard it. He did not answer immediately. That was characteristic of him, not because he lacked a response, but because his processing happened somewhere internal, somewhere that didn't always translate into immediate speech. He had grown up in a household where the wrong word at the wrong moment had consequences. He had spent years inside a record label that required him to be agreeable, cooperative, commercially viable. He had learned through long practice how to absorb a thing before he reacted to it. Sometimes that absorption looked like passivity, sometimes it looked like nothing at all. But something shifted in the room. Anyone paying attention could feel it. Marvin reached for a guitar. This is the part of the story that people who were there have remembered most clearly. Not because it was dramatic in the way that confrontations are dramatic, with raised voices and obvious tension, but because it was so quiet. He didn't announce what he was doing. He didn't say anything about proving a point or responding to a slight. He didn't look in Sly's direction. He just picked up the instrument the way you pick up something familiar, the way a person reaches for an object they have handled 10,000 times without thinking about it. There was no ceremony in the gesture. That was what made it devastating. And then he started to play. What came out was not a simple demonstration. It was not the musical equivalent of a rebuttal, structured and obvious, designed for an audience. It was the kind of playing that happens when someone stops performing and starts thinking out loud. He moved through chord shapes that suggested a formal understanding of harmony, the kind that doesn't come from instinct alone, but from years of sitting alone with an instrument and asking it questions. He bent notes. He shifted into melodic runs that belonged to a different tradition than anything Motown had ever packaged under his name. He played with the relaxed, slightly distracted quality of someone who is not showing you what he can do, but simply doing it. The room had gone quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Sly Stone was watching. He didn't say anything for a long moment. The people who were present have described his expression in slightly different terms. Surprised, recalibrating, still, but the consistent detail is that he stopped talking. The easy authority that had been in his voice when he made his comment about Marvin was no longer there. Not replaced by embarrassment exactly, more like replaced by attention, the genuine kind, the kind a musician gives to something that has earned it. The session moved on. Nobody made a speech about what had just happened. Marvin didn't look up to check whether the point had landed. He just set the guitar down when he was done with it, and the conversation in the room resumed its course as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But it had occurred. What Sly Stone hadn't known, what a lot of people around Marvin hadn't known, or had forgotten, or had chosen not to see, was that Marvin had been a working musician long before Motown found him and decided what he was for. He had played piano as a child, absorbing the church music that his father's strict Pentecostal world was saturated with. He had moved through the doo-wop circuit in Washington, D.C. as a teenager, learning how groups worked from the inside. He had played drums. He had learned to navigate multiple instruments not as a trained technician, but as someone who was genuinely curious about how sound was assembled, about what made a chord feel the way it felt, about the relationship between what a musician heard in their head and what came out when their hands touched something. Motown had taken that person and built a different one on top of him. The smooth vocalist, the romantic lead, the voice that could sell a duet without making the audience think too hard about what was underneath it. That construction was commercially useful and personally suffocating in roughly equal measure, because it required Marvin to keep presenting a partial version of himself, to walk into rooms and let people assume that his gift began and ended at his throat. The studio musicians who played on his sessions knew better. The engineers who watched him correct chord arrangements from across the room knew better. But the people who wrote about him, who categorized him, who decided where he fit in the story of American music, they were working from the surface. And the surface was what Motown had given them. He had let it happen. That was the part he carried with him. Not just the industry's reduction of who he was, but his own compliance with it, his own silence. The years of not correcting the assumption because correcting it would have required a kind of directness that sat uneasily inside a man who had been taught from childhood that asserting yourself had costs. After What's Going On, something had shifted in how Marvin understood the silence. The album had come from the parts of himself that Motown hadn't created and couldn't control. The part that was paying attention to the world, that was asking questions no romantic ballad could accommodate, that needed to be answered as a whole person rather than a marketable persona. The fight to release it had been exhausting and clarifying in equal measure. He had won, and winning had taught him something about the price of letting other people define the boundaries of what he was. Sly Stone had not known any of this when he made his comment. He had been operating on the assumption that was available to him. The public Marvin, the Motown Marvin, the singer who stood at microphones and made audiences feel things. It was an honest mistake in the sense that it was based on real information. It was also the kind of mistake that only survives in the presence of someone who has decided not to correct it. Marvin corrected it, not with words which could be argued with, not with anger, which would have given the moment a different shape, with the thing itself, with the direct, unmediated evidence of his hands on the strings and what they produced. There is something particular about that kind of correction, the kind that bypasses language and puts the fact in front of you where you can't talk around it. It is, in its way, the most complete answer to a wrong assumption because it doesn't ask you to take anyone's word for anything. It just shows you. Sly Stone was, above everything else, a musician. He knew what he had heard. In the years that followed, Sly's own story moved in increasingly difficult directions. Isolation, addiction, a disappearance from public life that had its own tragic shape. And Marvin's story continued its long, complicated arc toward the violence that ended it in April 1984. The two men moved through the rest of their lives carrying the particular weight that their era placed on black artists who tried to be more than the music industry's version of them. But that moment in that room, the guitar, the silence, the watching, stayed in the memories of the people who witnessed it in a way that many louder moments did not. Because what Marvin Gaye demonstrated that day was not just technical ability. It was something harder to name and harder to dismiss. The capacity to let the truth of who you are speak in its own voice, in its own time, without asking for permission, to reach for the instrument and play it, to give the room no choice but to hear you, not the version of you that was convenient for someone else's understanding, but the actual, full, complicated, deeply musical you that had been there all along, waiting quietly for the right moment to make itself known. He set the guitar down. He didn't look around for a reaction. He already knew what he had played.